Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants event. My name is Joe Gabrowski, and I'll be your host for today. If this is your first time ever joining us, we are all about bringing science, exploration, adventure, and conservation live into classrooms across North America and beyond. So if you head over to exploringbytheseat.com, you'll see that we do anywhere from 40, 50, even 60 live events a month for classrooms. So sign up and register there, tune in via YouTube, grab a camera spot and interact. You will have tons of fun and lots to choose from. So this last month, we have been celebrating space exploration. We've been talking to scientists, we've been talking to engineers, we've been talking to astronauts who've shared their stories and their contributions as we explore our planet, as we explore our solar system, and beyond. So we've been having a lot of fun doing that. We're going to continue on today. We're going to join Ben Feist. He is a data visualization software engineer at NASA's Johnson Space Center, where he is building exploration science systems that will enable humanity's return to the moon in 2024. And he's got a pretty awesome story. He spent his career in the online digital space, and he was working on a little side project that caught NASA's attention, bringing some of the old Apollo missions to life. They were so impressed, they brought him onto the team, which is pretty amazing to say that you were headhunted by NASA. In 2019, he was part of the team behind the critically acclaimed Apollo 11 IMAX film, which took home 3 Emmys, and his Apollo Mission Control restoration team work earned him the Texas Governor's Award for Historic Preservation. So pretty darn cool. We're going to learn a little bit about the Apollo 17 mission, our last trip to the moon. So Ben, it's so great to have you joining us live today from Toronto, Ontario. We're excited to get to know you a little bit better. And, you know, I got a little sneak peek at this. The images and the story is so great. We're really excited.
Well, thanks very much for having me. It's very exciting to talk to a group of classrooms, and I can hardly wait to hear what the questions are the students have.
All right, excellent. Well, mentioning those classrooms, we have several classrooms tuning in live via YouTube or Facebook. Use that chat sidebar. Let us know where you're tuning in from. And of course, send us in some questions. We've got a great group of live classrooms on camera in Canada and the US. We're looking forward to meeting. Ben, I'm going to let you take over for a little bit, and then we will get to that Q&A action.
Sure. Please put up my presentation and we can get started. Okay, so I'm going to take you through the story of what happened on the last trip to the moon as part of the Apollo series. But first, a little bit more about myself, just in case you missed it. I'm a software engineer, so I'm not really a historian. I'm a person that makes things on the internet. And I studied computer science in university. And now I work at NASA, helping to build systems that are going to help mission control people when we go back to the moon in 2024. And there's a picture here of the Apollo 11 film that maybe some of you have seen. And if you haven't, then please go see it. Or I think it's available on several streaming sites. This tells the story of the first mission to the moon in a unique way, where we're only looking at historical material the whole time you're watching the film. So we landed on the moon 6 times between 1969 and 1972. So that was between 51 years ago and 48 years ago. And today we're going to talk about that last trip to the moon that happened 48 years ago this December. And it's really kind of amazing to think that we went to the moon 6 times, but that only took 3.5 years between the first and the last landing. And people back then, they thought that this was normal. They thought that, okay, now after Neil Armstrong stepped on the surface on Apollo 11, and they got used to watching us go back regularly, they thought this is just the way it was now. The humanity just went to the moon all the time. And they didn't realize that it was a really special time in history, and that Apollo 17 was going to be the last one for over a generation. So if we go into a little bit more about Apollo 17, these are the 3 people that went to the moon. So on the left, we have astronaut Jack Schmidt. At the top right, we have Ron Evans. He was the command module pilot who waited in lunar orbit for the other 2 to come back after they were on the surface. And on the bottom there, we have Commander Gene Cernan. He was in charge of the mission. The rocket launched at night. It was the only night launch of a Saturn V rocket. And the Saturn V rocket is this rocket you see here in the picture, and it was only used for the Apollo lunar missions. So it hasn't been flown since Apollo 17. And actually, the only ones that exist anymore are sitting in museums for you to go visit. You can actually look at them because there were actually 3 more missions scheduled, Apollo 18, 19, 20, but they were canceled by funding cuts. So that it turned out the last one was 17. So that's why we have some sitting in museums for everybody to go look at, and they haven't all been launched into space. This was the most powerful rocket that has ever flown. It had 7.5 million pounds of thrust, and it could carry a lot of weight to lunar orbit, and it's much, much more powerful than any of the rockets that are currently flying today. And I'm going to show you some footage here of the launch. And because it was launched at night, it was actually really hard to photograph. And as part of the team that has made some of these space films, like the Apollo 11 film, I have access to a lot of archival material. So this is some engineering footage that was shot during the night launch. And not a lot of people have seen this before. So I'm going to play that for you now.
10, 9, 8, 7, ignition sequence.
Now, it was very hard to film because the frame was so bright. And if I try to go back here, let's see if I can scroll. Oh, no, I can't. Never mind. The film, you saw the frame fill with light in that one shot. It was 80% the brightness of noonday sun when it was up there. And it lit the entire Florida coast as though it was the middle of the day as it was going up. And they got into low Earth orbit and lit the engine again to slingshot around the back of Earth and to head towards the moon. And on the way out, they took this picture. So this was about 6 hours after launch. They're 45,000 kilometers, or about 28,000 miles away from Earth. And because of their night launch, the trajectory, or the direction in which the rocket flew, put them right between the Earth and the sun. So the Earth was completely lit by the sun in this picture. And it's the only picture taken by a person that has a fully lit Earth. And this is the most popular photograph in all of NASA's archive. So they decelerated as they headed towards the moon because they were kind of flying out of Earth's gravity. And so Earth was pulling on the rocket. So it started going really quickly and it was going more and more slowly, kind of like coasting up a hill on your bike. You've got momentum, but the hill's trying to pull you down with gravity. But they had enough speed to get out of the gravity well of the Earth when they were headed towards the moon. And then as they crossed the center point, they started accelerating and falling downhill towards the moon, if you can think of it that way. So there was a middle point where they were at the top of between the two gravity wells, and then they started sliding towards the moon. And then when they got to the moon, they separated the lander from the command module and did this little pirouette in front of them, which you can see the footage here. They rolled the little camera that they had to film this, and they were just checking to make sure all the legs had extended properly to land. And that lander has Gene Cernan and Jack Schmidt inside it, and this film is being shot by Ron Evans in the command module. And then when they came back around the front side of the moon again, here's some footage shot from the lunar module now, shooting you can see the little dot on the horizon there, the command module with Ron Evans in it. And they're about to pan down here and look at their landing site in this valley. You can actually see it right down there. That's where they're going to land on the next orbit. So they're just going around one last time, making sure they're on the right path. And this valley is a very difficult place to land. It was 3 times deeper than the Grand Canyon. So each speck of dust just flew at a perfect arc and then landed on the moon somewhere else. And here's where they landed. Here's a picture they took after they got out. But there's their lander, and that's where they sat, and they deployed the American flag. And this is where they lived for 3 days on the surface. So there's no air and no water and no wind, of course, because you can't have wind without air. And when they walked around, you can kind of see the path they look like paths around the surface there, around the lander. That's where they walked and did things and deployed experiments. And those footprints will stay on the moon for hundreds of thousands of years because there's no erosion. So this is Lunar Module pilot Jack Schmidt, and he's a very important astronaut. He was the Lunar Module pilot on Apollo 17. But the important thing is that he's the only scientist to go to the moon. Everybody else that went to the moon, including the other people on Apollo 17, were all pilots and test pilots from the military. And he actually was a geologist. He studied rocks. And he studied rocks, did his PhD, and then applied when there were applications open for openings within NASA for astronaut scientists. And he got picked. And next thing you know, well, not next thing you know, years later, after lots of training, he found himself on the surface of the moon conducting geology. So if you imagine, you went to school for all those years to learn about geology, and you get to go to the moon and learn about the moon's geology. It's pretty amazing. This is a picture that Gene Cernan took of Jack with the Earth just right behind them to give you an idea of just how far away they were. All the astronauts talked about how impactful it was to just look up in the sky, and instead of seeing the moon like we're all used to on Earth, they saw the Earth, and it was about 2.5 times bigger than the moon is in our sky. And they could put their thumb up in the air and cover the Earth with their thumb. And they thought, my goodness, where are we right now? And here's a picture of Jack loading something into the Lunar Rover. This is the little car that they had driving around. And some of these photographs, like the ones I've just been showing you, they're just incredible because they were taken on very large film negatives. So they look beautiful. They're 70 millimeter Hasselblad cameras, and they took 2,400 70 millimeter stills and 3,600 overall photographs on this mission. And they collected a lot of samples. The real reason that they went to the moon, or the big reason for 17, especially having Jack there as a geologist, was to pick up rocks and make sure they were collected carefully to understand where they were when they were gathered through a process called documenting of a sample. So here's another 70 millimeter photograph of something that they want to sample, this boulder that's in the foreground. They want to chip a piece of that off and bring it back to try to analyze it. So they had this calibration tool that they would put on the surface. It's just a little tripod. It weighed very little. And it would give you an idea of what that vertical bar was always floating around in a bearing. So it was perfectly straight up and down. And they had a little color bar on the side. So when they took pictures, they would be able to make sure that they developed the film properly to give proper color correction. But you can see that little red and blue bars at the top that show you that this is a color photograph. But that is not a very colorful place. And I find it just amazing how starkly absent color is on the lunar surface and how much color there is on Earth in comparison. It's really something incredible. What gives everything that's color on Earth that doesn't give it color on the moon? So to document a sample, they would, here's one of their 70 millimeter cameras. You can see there, that's Gene Cernan with the camera pointed at the rock. And he's going to take a picture cross sun, and then he takes another picture that's called a locator that is a picture of the Lunar Module. Where are we standing in relation to where we stopped sorry, not the Lunar Module, the Lunar Rover. Where are we in relation to the rover? And then a locator, so this is called a locator photo, and then an after photo after they had taken the piece off. And you can see their footprints on the ground where they had been doing this work. So these photographs would then be used in comparison with the sample when it got back to Earth to say, okay, where was this one in this bag? And they could go back and look at these photographs and understand what kind of boulder had been taken off. So here's a composite of several pictures that Gene Cernan took, and that's Jack Schmidt in the bottom left, in front of this huge boulder that's up on the side of a mountain called the North Massif. And so he took several pictures, and then they've been stitched together here in Photoshop to make it one really wide angle picture. And this is one of my favorite photographs from all of the Apollo missions because it gives you a real sense of the place they're in. And just look at this valley that they were in. And which I didn't realize for years, but in this picture is the lunar module, the lander that they landed in. And you guys are going to have to squint your eyes to try to guess where it is, but I'm going to save you the trouble so you don't all crowd around the laptop looking. And I'll put an arrow there. It's right there. It's this little speck, and I'm going to zoom in so you can actually see it. But this gives you an idea of how far away from the lunar module they drove that lunar rover around. They were they were many kilometers away from the lunar module here. And they drove a total distance of 35 kilometers when they were on the surface for 3 days. So here, if I zoom that photo to 100%, you can actually see it sitting there, and you can see this sort of white streak that's right below the speck of a lunar module. And here's a 500 millimeter photograph that was taken from the same rock. And that white area is where the rocket engine that they were landing to slow down and make sure they landed softly with pushed itself across the surface. All the thrust pushing, like we saw those dust streaks pushing away from the engine, left this kind of white haze everywhere, because what it did is it disrupted the lunar surface that hasn't been disrupted in billions of years. And that disruption they called scrubbing, and it changed the color. It's called the albedo of the surface. And here, if you zoom this 500 millimeter photograph to 100%, you can see that from that little tiny vehicle they sat in and slept in for 3 days. And that this picture always gets me, is just how fragile that spacecraft looks. Like, that's their only way home. And if something goes wrong, there's no escape. There's no one coming to rescue them. There was only one rocket. And they had to be really careful and make sure they did everything properly, because it was so dangerous if something went wrong. And here's a picture of Commander Cernan inside. And it was hard work working out on the lunar surface for 8 hours every day. And you can see how dusty their spacesuits and their helmets are all covered in lunar dust. And you can kind of get a sense here of how fine the dust is. The dust is so fine, it's almost like ashes from a fireplace. And if you get ashes on your hands, or if you get charcoal dust, something like that on your hands, and you start touching things, you would leave fingerprints just like those ones on the helmets. And because they would come back into the lunar module and fill the lunar module with air again so they could take their suits off and live, and then all the dust that was on their suits would become airborne for the first time, because it's always just been sitting on the lunar surface. And they said it smelled like spent gunpowder. It had this strange smell to it, and it would get up in their noses just like dust does, and it would cause what they kind of jokingly called lunar hay fever, where they would kind of be sneezing and stuffy nose. And you could actually hear them on the radio when they were talking to Earth. They sounded like they kind of had a cold, and it was just because they had inflamed sinuses. And I think Commander Cernan got kind of sick of being dirty. And he took this kind of funny photo with Jack. At the end of 3 days, they lit the engine and broke off from the descent module, and the ascent stage went right back up into lunar orbit. And the camera that took this picture, as you can see, it tracked upward to watch them take off. That was controlled from the Lunar Rover from Earth, because it had a little antenna and a radio on it, and somebody in mission control with 2 joysticks could pan around and zoom in and out. And here's that person panning around from mission control. And you can see the descent stage there, just sitting there, the legs that they don't need for landing anymore, and the engine they don't need anymore, they left behind, because it's all about saving weight when you're flying to the moon. As you're moving along, if you have used pieces that you need and you don't need them anymore, don't bring them back to Earth, because they weigh too much. And if the more weight you bring back to Earth, the more fuel you need. And it's this kind of it's a difficult thing to worry about, in that if you, for every little bit of weight you add, you have to add more rocket fuel, and then you have to make a bigger rocket, and then the bigger rocket weighs more, and it just gets really complicated and difficult. Trying to manage weight is the biggest deal. And here's some footage of that ascent stage of the lunar module rising up from the moon surface to rendezvous with the command module with Ron Evans inside. And this whole idea of being able to rendezvous, which basically means meet each other in orbit, in lunar orbit, was such a difficult thing to decide to do, because they had to decide that this is how they were going to fly on Apollo in the early 1960s, when they hadn't even done this kind of rendezvous in Earth orbit. And it was seen as a crazy, almost science fiction like way of doing it, because there's so many things we don't know how to do. How could we possibly plan to do something so difficult as to meet in lunar orbit? But they did, obviously, and you can see this amazing spacecraft. And maybe if you look in the little black windows, you can see one of the astronauts peeking out on the left there, that are inside this spacecraft. And if you can see how fragile it looks, this spacecraft is a very strange looking thing. I mean, it's not very aerodynamic. It doesn't look like a jet, does it? But there's no air, so it doesn't have to be aerodynamic. Like I mentioned earlier, it just has to be really light. And that weight savings, I'm going to talk about it again here, for every pound that you brought up from the lunar surface. So that means all the rocks inside, the astronauts, and the spacecraft itself. For every pound it weighed, you needed to launch 215 pounds of Saturn V weight. So you can see what kind of pressure the people at Grumman in Long Island, New York, who built this, how much pressure they were under it from NASA to keep it lightweight, and that's why it looks the way it does. And this is a picture taken from the lunar module at the same moment of the command module, and this has Ron Evans in the bottom part there, the cone-shaped spacecraft at the bottom is the command module, and the cylinder attached to the bottom of it with the panel missing on the side is the service module. And there's no people in there. That's just where rocket fuel to power the big rocket you can see on the end at the top of the picture there, and cameras and stuff that were inside that were mapping the lunar surface. So the whole time Jack and Gene were on the surface doing their work, Ron Evans was in orbit managing for a long time, for about 40 years, were the very best maps we had of the moon. And because if you were in the command module, you couldn't reach the film that was in the service module. Ron Evans had to halfway back from the moon. Here they've lit the engine and they're on their way back home, coasting home, coming back to Earth. And Ron Evans had to get out, and he was going to wave to his mom. He says, "Hi, Mom." He actually said, "Hi, Mom," in the transcripts. He in deep space. So this is the last spacewalk to have occurred in deep space. He shimmies down the middle and he goes and he grabs the film canisters from the high resolution cameras. And here's a picture that I think Jack took this picture of Ron by standing up in the doorway of the command module out in space and just taking pictures of Ron as he came back. And you can see the film that he's got with him. So they got back in and coasted back home, and they did a few more experiments on board just to make sure they weren't wasting any of their time in space. And then when they got to the Earth, they didn't have any rockets anymore that they could use to slow down, or any of the stuff that they did on the moon to use rockets to slow down and land. Instead, they used the Earth's atmosphere to slow down. And the way you do that is they arrived going very quickly. So let me explain how fast they were going. Here's how fast it flakes off. That energy from the heat goes with it, and that's how the spacecraft removes its energy from itself, so it doesn't overheat the people inside. And here you can actually see some footage. This is actually footage of Apollo 11, because they landed right at dawn, and so they were able to get this from a telescope that was on board an airplane. And that glowing ball is after the heat shield is ablated off, and now they're in such dense air that here, I'll play that again actually. Now they're in such dense air that it's just glowing hot and slowly cooling down as they slow down. And at 3,600 feet per second, at Mach 32, it looks this hot. And then at 24,000 feet, a little parachute called a drogue chute opened, and you can see it in the footage here on the bottom left. This little white parachute opened up that just to pull them back, because it was going about 300 or maybe 400 kilometers per hour when the chute opened, and that slowed them down to 200 because they couldn't open the main parachutes until they were going under 200 kilometers per hour. And so then once they got going slow enough at 10,000 feet, the main chutes open, and here you can see them unfurling. This footage is actually sped up. It took quite a while for them to unfurl. And as they unfurled, they slowed down drastically to 35 kilometers per hour. So all that speed from the fastest that humans have ever traveled down to 35 kilometers per hour using these parachutes. Now, it's kind of interesting to remember these parachutes have been packed away inside the top of the command module for all the time that they were on the lunar surface and taking all those photos. So it was in, for the whole 13 days, those parachutes have been in space. And they actually, because they're in space, they couldn't have had any air in them. So they had to pack them so tightly, they were almost as tightly packed as a block of cement when they were packed away. So that when they were in this vacuum of space, there was no air inside that would unpack those parachutes. So here's some footage after the mains had opened, and they're getting close to the surface, and they splash.
Great deal of cheering going on here in the control center as they splash down is watched in real time from the recovery helicopter. Mark the time at 3:04:31, ground elapsed time even.
And there's everybody in mission control, looking pretty relieved.
The command module is stable one. The sea state is mild.
Now there's some footage there of them with cigars in their mouths. I think that guy's just smoking because he wants to. They're not celebrating yet. The rule was you're not allowed to light your cigars until they're safely on board the carrier. So here they are, it's floating. They know that the mission's over, but they still have to safely recover the astronauts, and they put them in this net and brought them up to a helicopter, and then flew the helicopter back to this aircraft carrier. And this aircraft carrier was the USS Ticonderoga, which is now decommissioned. It was a very old aircraft carrier even then. And Ron Evans he was a Navy aviator. He had served on the USS Ticonderoga about 8 years earlier. And here he is being retrieved after having been to the moon and landed right back on the carrier that he used to serve on 8 years earlier when he was in the Navy. You can imagine what a rival that must have been for him to show off to his buddies to say, hey, how you doing? I just came back from the moon. What have you been up to? And this command module, this is a picture I took at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, is on display at the museum there, and anybody can go and see it. This little piece, it was the only piece that we got back from the Saturn V rocket, that giant rocket that took off to go to the moon. All the rest was discarded along the way to reduce the amount of weight that we needed to bring back. Now, I took all of this story that I just told you, and I'm just going to talk about this very briefly. And this is the work that I did, is I put it all on a website that you can go to, and you can watch everything I just told you as it actually happened, but all of the photographs, all of the audio, all of the film footage, you can watch it in real time. And this December, you'll be able to watch during the anniversary, exactly 48 years later to the second. And it starts around at December 7th, really, like December 6th, very late at night is the launch, because it was a night launch. But they don't land on the moon until December 9th. So this December 9th, if you want to watch them walking around on the surface, just go to this website and tune in, press that now button, and you'll be able to feel like they're on the moon right now, but it was right now 48 years ago. And on this website are some animations that I made, and here's a picture of one of them. And this is using some of the newer maps that we have of the moon from a satellite called the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter that's still mapping the moon. And so every single thing you see here is actually on the surface. Even though this is a computer animation, it's a computer animation of real lunar data. And this is a recreation of the valley that they landed in, the Valley of Taurus Littrow. And as the camera flies over here, you'll get an idea of where they were, because they'll zoom in down to their landing site. You'll be able to see if you can spot the lunar module as we get closer. I think I can see it. It's on the bottom right. And here it comes. And there it is on the right side of the image. So here's the camera flying around it. You can actually see the footprints in the surface in the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter data of where they walked around. And this is all in Apollo in real time. And you can, as they drive around on the surface and they're talking as they're driving, I have these animations showing exactly where they drove. And you know, what are they thinking about when they're driving along? What were they saying, and were they lost? And sometimes they kind of were. And here, you know, for example, they drove up to the side of this amazing crater called Shorty Crater. And here's an animation that I have of that moment where they drove up to the edge. And they made an amazing discovery at this crater where they found soil. Remember, I talked about how little color there was on the moon. They found orange soil on the ground here, and they had no expectation to find anything like that. And it was such an amazing discovery. They got very excited on the radio and brought it back to be studied. So that's my story about Apollo 17. I'm just going to briefly talk about something very exciting happening, and that is our current return to the moon program called the Artemis program. So NASA is working hard right now with all kinds of companies from across the United States to build the spacecraft required and to do the work required to return to the moon by 2024. And it's called Artemis for a very particular reason, and that Artemis in Greek mythology was Apollo's twin sister. So it's the sister of the Apollo program, and it's not called sister for nothing. We have a very diverse astronaut corps at this point, and we're going to have the first woman walking on the moon on the Artemis program. So we're going to have the first woman and the next man on the moon by 2024. And here's a picture that a friend of mine took at Johnson Space Center with the head of the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, actually, the chief program scientist, Dr. Noah Petro, at the front there, giving a lesson to a very special classroom. And you can see this might look a lot like the classroom that you guys are in, but this is a class of the next class of astronauts at Johnson Space Center. And actually, this was last summer, and they're using Apollo in real time on the front screen there to show what happened on Apollo 17. I think Dr. Petro is teaching them the lesson about how Jack Schmidt was looking for the rock that didn't fit the rest of the rocks that you could see in a given area, and it's the one that doesn't fit that's interesting, and to get it within the context of the others to try to tell the story of how the valley formed. And it's some of the people that are in this picture that will probably be on the Artemis program, and maybe somebody in this picture will be the first person to walk on the moon since the Apollo program. So this is just a graph that kind of shows the progression of the different Artemis flights, and this is how we're going to get there. Artemis III is the third Artemis flight, and it's the one where we're going to have crewed people on the surface. So crew means people, so people on the surface. The first one, Artemis I, first human spacecraft to the moon, so it's going to be an autonomous flight with nobody on board. Artemis II is going to go around the moon but not land on it, kind of like Apollo 8 did. And then Artemis III is going to be the landing. Excuse me. And here's a picture. I'm not going to try to explain what this diagram is, but just to talk about how Artemis III is going to get to the moon, and with various stages, kind of like Apollo had its very unique way of getting to and from the moon. Artemis is going to have a very different situation where there's going to be a space station in orbit around the moon as well, called the Gateway. And the Gateway is going to play a part in how we get to the moon and land, and whether we bring material all the way back to Earth to study, or do we bring it back up to the Gateway, that's all stuff to be studied and determined. Here's a picture of the Orion probe, so like what I was calling the Apollo Command Module. The equivalent for the Artemis program is the Orion module. And here's a picture of it. You can see it's kind of the same shape, this cone shape. And that's very specifically because of the way you re-enter in the atmosphere, pushes on the bottom of it. That is the shape that the spacecraft has to be. But the Orion spacecraft is bigger and, of course, more advanced than the command module was, because it's 50 years later and technology has moved quite a bit. But this is ready to fly and ready to go. Here's a computer rendering of the SLS rocket, which the Orion is going to go at the top of that rocket. And this rocket will be more powerful than the Saturn V rocket. The Block 2 of this rocket will have 11.7 million pounds of thrust capability. And you'll remember that the Apollo Saturn V only had 7.5 million pounds of thrust. And here's actually a picture I took of one of the fuel tanks being tested at Marshall Space Flight Center. And they were basically twisting and putting it under pressure to see at what point did it fail, so they could understand what kind of pressures of fuel they could put in it and what kind of tolerances it'll have to make sure it was safe. And the Artemis program is not going to go to one of those spots on the equator like you saw in the first slide of my presentation. It's going to go to a very special place. It's going to go to the South Pole of the moon. And it's very hard to get to the South Pole. And the reason we're going there is a very specific reason. And is that a program that we had several years ago called the LCROSS, which was a Centaur rocket empty stage, impacted one of the craters on the South Pole in an area that's permanently shadowed. So a permanently shadowed area doesn't sound like it makes much sense, but there are spots on the moon that the sun never shines. As you saw there, I'm going to play that again. You saw how as the moon's day changes, so this is over a month period, of course, because remember the moon goes around the Earth once a month. You can see in the craters that there are spots that never get any sun. They just stay dark. And so the Centaur rocket impacted into one of these permanently shadowed areas and looked at the impact stuff that came flying up. So there was a satellite that looked at the impact site as it happened, and they looked at what came flying out of that permanently shadowed crater, and they found something called hydroxyl, which is a key indicator that water ice is present in the floor of the crater. And they estimate that roughly 6% of the material that came up was water. So this means if you mine and refine the material that's in these permanently shadowed areas, that you might be able to get the water out. And water is a very important thing, that it can be turned into, of course, water for people to drink. If you break the atoms of the molecule of water apart, you get hydrogen and oxygen. And hydrogen is rocket fuel and oxygen is air to breathe. So it becomes material that we can use to live on the moon. And we don't have to bring everything with us from the Earth. And these permanently shadowed regions are very cold. And I'm not sure, I don't understand the physics enough to understand why, but a normal shadow on the moon is very cold. So if you're standing on the moon, the shadow that you're casting, in that shadow, it's minus 173 degrees Celsius. But in these permanently shadowed regions, it's minus 249 degrees Celsius. So they're super cold areas, and this is part of the difficulty of going in there. Anything that we put in there to try to extract that material, to do that refining that I talked about, will have to be able to operate in that extreme cold environment. And almost everything that we're used to engineering on Earth would break instantaneously in that environment. So it's a huge challenge to try to figure out how we can do that. And here's a rendering from NASA of what it might look like on the South Pole, with a very low sun angle casting very long shadows, although these shadows are very soft in this picture, and they would be very harsh. I don't think they would be as soft as this. It would be pitch black inside any of the shadows, and you would need very bright lights on your spacesuit, like you can see here, to cast some light into those shadowed areas as we try to understand how to use the resources in those permanently shadowed regions. And the long-term goal of Artemis is to establish a permanent moon base, permanent human residence on the surface, kind of like we have with the International Space Station right now. Is we've always had people on board the space station for a very long time. And we're planning on having people always on the moon learning to live in another place. It is very important for humanity to learn to live in places other than the Earth if we want humanity to live on for a long, long time. So that's the end of my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions that any of you have. And thank you very much again for having me. I look forward to your questions.
All right, Ben, thank you for that awesome presentation. I mean, it's so long ago since we were there last, and to think, you know, in such a short period of time it happened. Those photos, those images, the story is amazing. So thank you for sharing that with us today. And it makes it even more exciting as we look towards 2024 and hopefully a return to the moon. So awesome. Ben, thank you so much for today.
Thank you.
All right. Well, classrooms who are tuning in via YouTube, send me in a couple of questions. We'll start meeting some of our camera classrooms as well. So let's start off here. Let's go to our class in St. Catharines, Delaware, grade 5s. I'm going to bring them in live. How are we doing, grade 5s? Good. All right. Who's got a question?
So one person. Who's got one person? What's your question?
Did people go like all the way around the world? I mean, moon.
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing.
He wanted to know if the astronauts went all the way around the moon.
Yes, they went they went all the way around the moon several times. They orbited around the moon. They went, you can kind of picture it going from the Earth to the moon and then orbiting around the moon and then coming all the way back in a figure 8.
All right, so then bring our next group here. It is Miss Barnes' group and Miss Erickson's group. They're joining us in Connecticut. How are we doing?
Good. Good.
Okay, go ahead and ask
I
your
love
question.
your mask.
If there's no wind on the moon, then how is the flag staying up?
Yeah, they had, so for the flag, they didn't want it just draping down, hanging on the pole, kind of like it would in your classroom. They wanted to be able to see it in the pictures and stuff. So they actually made a telescoping little thing like the antenna on a radio across the top. So they would pull it open as they extended the flag, and it would hang on that rod as it sat on the pole. And the Apollo 11 one, the first landing on the moon, the telescoping pole, they couldn't get out more than about 3/4. So the flag didn't get fully extended flat. So it's got this kind of wrinkle in it like this, and it just hung there with a wrinkle. And they decided, well, I guess it's okay. It looks like it's waving in the breeze. Isn't that nice?
All right, let's grab another live group here. This time we're going to go to our 4th grades in Eden Prairie. They're joining virtually. How you doing?
We're doing really well. We have a question for you. What discoveries were made about the moon on after Apollo 11? What else did they learn about the moon after the first moon landing?
Well, they learned a huge amount with the totality of all 6 Apollo missions, and that they landed in different spots for very specific reasons to get samples from different areas. For example, Apollo 16 landed in a highlands area that would have a different type of lunar material. And 17 was the culmination in that it had all kinds of different stuff on it. There was a landslide that happened in one area, and they gathered samples from there. And there was a scarp, like a wrinkle in the surface, and they took samples from the scarp. And they're basically doing what you do if you walk through a valley on Earth and you're a field geologist and you're trying to understand how the valley formed. So 11 had very interesting samples, but it was really more about making sure we could land safely and get astronauts back again. And it was kind of like, just get some material into the box kind of thing. They didn't do that careful documenting process that I showed you for 17, because they were only on the surface for just over 2.5 hours on Apollo 11. But it turned out some of the material they scooped into their rock box on Apollo 11, some of the dust specifically, was a very excellent sample that helped to tell the whole story. But what did we learn in totality from all the Apollo program was that the moon is actually made of the same material as the Earth, and it's roughly the same age as the oldest material we find on Earth. And it furthered the theory that the moon was created when a Mars-sized planet hit the early Earth and split it apart, and all this material came flying off the Earth into Earth's orbit and formed the moon. And it made the Earth molten and the moon molten, and that was about 4.5 billion years ago. And basically everything that we have in the scientific literature that talks about the very early Earth is referred from a lot of the science that was done studying the lunar samples that have been brought back. And we are still studying the lunar samples that were brought back. They're kept in Building 31 at Johnson Space Center, and they are researched regularly. In fact, there's a lot of the samples that we haven't even opened yet from Apollo, keeping them in pristine shape, waiting for our technology to progress, knowing that we weren't going back to the moon anytime soon for the past 48 years. They didn't want to open them all in 1972. They actually had the foresight to wait until instruments got more sensitive so that we could continue to discover from Apollo. And that is still going on today. In fact, they just opened last year one of the deep core samples from Station 3 on Apollo 17 that Gene Cernan took when he was there. And they're studying that right now.
All right, very cool. We've got a question here from Mr. Thoreau, and he's wondering, are you a moon landing collector? Do you have any memorabilia?
No, not really. I mean, I have one or two little things. I do collect little, these little things. They're like commemorative coins. This is the 40th anniversary of, I think this one's Apollo 11. But I'm not collecting autographs or anything like that. I feel like it's better to try to offer something to the people that went to the moon rather than asking them for things. So every time I get a chance to meet an Apollo astronaut, I try to make sure I give them maybe some archival footage they've never seen of themselves, or even building things like Apollo in real time that commemorate the work that they did rather than asking them for things like autographs.
All right, back to YouTube here. Miss Gretka's class is joining us, and they're wondering if you know what the equivalent cost of the Apollo 17 mission would be today.
That's a tough one because all the costs are really about the whole Apollo program. And the whole Apollo program was quite expensive. It was $20 billion in 1969 dollars. But actually, that's if you mark that for inflation, that's a tiny amount compared to what the total GDP of the U.S. is now, even with inflation taken into consideration. And right now, NASA gets less than 1% of all the tax that's collected, and it's able to do all the exploration that you've seen, going to Mars with robots, and now returning to the moon. These are all amazing things that we are able to do and should do. I'm happy to discuss it further if you're interested. But the 400,000 people that worked on the Apollo program created a whole environment in the United States that was an engineering technology footing that the U.S. has benefited from since Apollo. And it's kind of hard to put your finger on exactly what the Apollo program did for the U.S. industry world, but because it had such a broad effect, it's hard to measure what would have happened if we didn't go. But I think Artemis is doing the same thing now. The amount of problems we have to solve, like engineering problems working in the permanently shallow regions, for example, are going to drive technology, and it's an important part of what we do.
All right. I love that perspective that, it wasn't just kind of that one moment in time, that so much has come out of that and so much technology. So, I mean, that really limits the price. It lowers the price when you stretch it out like that, I think.
Well, even the computer we're using now, like one of the very earliest computers ever built was built on the guidance computer that was on both the command module and the lunar module. In fact, a lot of people think we went the very first moment we could have because we needed a guidance computer to land on the moon. That's not something that could have been done manually by a pilot. And it was the first moment we had computers that weren't the size of a room and we could make that happen. And the way that drove technology forward, 30, 40 years, and then Silicon Valley came from that. It's really, really quite interesting.
All right, let's check in with a couple classrooms, see if they have a follow-up. Connecticut, Miss Barnes, Mrs. Erickson, do you have a follow-up question?
Yes, we do.
Awesome.
So, what does NASA do? Do they fund the landings and launchings? Do they build the rockets?
That's a good question. We do both. So NASA will, we have contracted out building of the landers, for example, the human landing system, the HLS for Artemis. That's going to be built by a company, but NASA says, hey, we need a landing system. Who wants to try to build one? Because we're going to send some people to the moon. And there's 3 different teams that are working on, competing with each other, working on a human landing system right now. And then in other situations, we're the ones building the rockets or designing the rocket with the help of companies as subcontractors. And that's the way that Apollo was done. And that's the way some of the other work is done within NASA.
All right. Minnesota, do you have another question for us from our 4th graders?
Yeah. How do scientists learn about the moon when they can't go there? What kind of knowledge can we gain from Earth about the moon?
Oh, yes, that's a great question. Lots of different ways that we can do it. You can use telescopes to analyze the surface and look for new impacts, because there still is material hitting the surface and new craters are being formed. We could study data from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. If you look up LRO Quick Map on the internet, you basically get like a Google Maps application that'll let you zoom in on the lunar surface using the data that's been gathered by the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter satellite that I mentioned earlier that is still mapping the moon today. You just saw an announcement this past week from the Sophia Experiment, which is a telescope on board an aircraft that flies very high and looks at the moon using a spectrometer that can actually detect the different materials that are on the surface, and some new discoveries about the density of the water on the surface and where it might be, and direct evidence of water, not just hydroxyl, like I mentioned earlier, was discovered using the Sophia experiment. So there's lots of remote sensing work that can be done without having to go there with people. But as I mentioned earlier, human exploration, it's more than just the science of learning about the rocks. It's about learning to live in other places and the human exploration that comes with that. And that's what the Artemis program is about.
All right. And so we have one more question here, Ben, that I think we'll use to wrap up today. This Mrs. Chartran's group. And they're wondering, do you think a colony on the moon could become economically productive? Or do you think, as things did with the earlier moon landings where we kind of got used to it and it wasn't as exciting anymore, do you think we'll fall into that trap again?
Well, if we depend on making the lunar landings a show, as it were, which, a big part of Apollo was the Cold War and getting there before the Russians and the space race aspect of it. And so it had to be this spectacle. I think it's very exciting, but, how many people are aware of the Antarctic research that goes on every year, for example, which is very, very exciting, very important work, collecting meteorites in Antarctica and doing other research there. And that is very difficult to do. It is very similar in terms of living in a very harsh environment that you wouldn't naturally be in on your own. But so that maybe the public doesn't notice it anymore, but this work continues. And that could be where we get to in the distant future, where people are so used to hearing about people on the moon that it's interesting, but it's not something they want to watch in the news every single day. And maybe similar to the International Space Station now. If you told somebody in the late 50s that there are always going to be people in orbit around the Earth, they would think that was so incredible they'd want to hear about it every day. But then, we get used to things over time. And sure, we like to hear from, like we did earlier this week with Jessica Meir, about that crazy adventure. It doesn't hit the same thing as with the Neil Armstrong's first steps on the moon were in 1969. So I think it, just because it doesn't have the highest ratings in the world doesn't mean it's not important to do. And I think it would just get someplace closer, like Antarctic exploration or International Space Station is today.
All right. Perfect way to put it. I couldn't agree with you more. And I look forward to the day where I can host, you know, the first live classroom broadcast from the moon with classrooms and tuning in and in real time. Maybe we can do that sometime soon.
That'd be great.
Ben, thank you so much for everything today. Thank you for bringing the work you're doing, bringing the Apollo missions to life. Really was an amazing period of history. And thank you for the future work that you're doing to bring Artemis to life. And, you know, it's going to add a whole exciting way for everybody to follow along and really feel like they're part of those missions. So thank you for everything you do, Ben.
Oh, thanks for having me. And thank you for the excellent questions. Those are really good.
All right. Well, shout out to all of our classrooms via YouTube. Thank you so much for joining us. A shout out to our camera classrooms. You were awesome. Thanks for the great questions. And we are going to sign off for today. Thanks, everyone.